Thank you so much, Ankur and Huma. What a pleasure to finally do this conversation with you and in all places here. For the record, she served 2 terms in the presidency. She's traveled the world, but the only place, perhaps one of the few places she's never visited, is the Maldives. Huma, why?
Well, I confess the Maldives has been on my bucket list for a long time. I am surprised as well. I was actually talking to Hillary very late last night. I had terrible insomnia, and my mind was just racing, and I wanted to get up and explore. But why we didn't make it is a mystery. That's why somehow a higher power planted the idea in your head.
So no regime change in this part of the world that you all were pursuing?
No regime. No regime change. No. We decided to, let the islands flourish as they have flourished.
Well, climate crisis is going to be a big issue in the islands around here, and one of the many issues that you all took up was climate crisis. Tell us a little bit about how you see this going forward. I know it's not part of your book, and we'll come to that, but I just wanted to get your sense of how you see the climate crisis today.
I thought the conversation we had last night at dinner made me very happy, but also sad. I mean, this notion that we're in paradise, essentially, and knowing that it's a place that may not exist in 20 years. And that's why I asked you, is that something that's acknowledged by the government and the citizens? And the answer is yes. And what does that say? That when I was growing up, we learned about the Day of Judgment, which is sort of the end of days, and it's sort of has really kind of shaken me a little bit, that this notion that these are realities that we just have to face and contend with. I think we're seeing with the war in Ukraine, the climate crisis, how much this has affected us, from whether it's food security, I remember having conversations in New York in 2000 and, I don't know, 18, 19, and I would be in conversations in New York, and people would say, I don't really know about this whole climate thing. I mean, a lot of this just seems to be sort of in your head. The earth just, warms, and then it's gonna balance right back. And a lot of times these were conversations with very privileged people. And I would say, but aren't you the guys who go skiing in Aspen this winter and you don't have enough snow? Aren't you the people who have mansions in Malibu and San Francisco and Northern California, and they're literally going into the water? Yeah, guess what? That's all about climate. And I actually wonder if part of it, some people who are climate deniers just feel it's the reality that is almost too hard to process, too hard to actually accept. But it is, unless we make drastic change, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, unless governments and countries come together and agree to basic principles that we've tried. I mean, I remember the conference that we were at in Copenhagen in 2009. These are big things that we have to do internationally around the world, not just the United States, but all throughout Europe and Asia, as you're seeing that'll affect it. But to live in a country, or live in a world today, where, I mean, your countries had to, ban the export on wheat. These are all related to the war, but also climate. I mean, the fact that there's a heat wave there, all of these things are connected. And I think teaching our children, I'm so happy that there are so many children here, how we act in the world. How amazing is it to walk around barefoot here? I mean, it's, let's accept, let's be present, let's be focused on how to protect our environment. But these are big decisions that have to be made and changes that have to be made.
But what do we need to do to get this narrative out? Do we need to do leaked emails? Do we need the Russians to hack into your system, or world leaders' systems? Will that make a difference, that it's a scandal actually buried there and it'll make news? What do we need to do?
I don't know that there's a scandal that's been buried there. I think we're like any other country, which is different administrations have different opinions as to how to deal with this climate crisis. And it's also being in conversation with our partners and our allies and agreeing, if we're gonna do this, in 2009, as you might remember, which is the last time I was in government in a serious climate conference, we had to be willing to make some very difficult choices in the United States, but India, Brazil, and China were at that table as well, and they had to make some difficult decisions. In that instance, there were tough commitments to be made, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. But the policy has to be sustained and carried out. And so for, our administration that followed us to all of a sudden say, well, we're pulling out of Paris. We're out. We don't, those have consequences. And so when people say, well, what's this administration doing? They've had to then overturn and frankly go back to the table a decade. And we don't have a decade in reality in some of these cases in the world. I remember traveling to Antarctica and going to, Greenland and going to Greenland and talking to scientists and saying, well, we had X number of polar bears here 5 years ago. These are things people just see and accept as reality. And I don't know, aside from saying that we need to just show people on a more sort of global basis how it's affecting their day-to-day lives. I mean, the wars about water. I mean, all of these things are coming our way, or are here, rather.
Coming back to your book, and for those of you who haven't read her book, it's the most extraordinary insight into two regimes, into two presidencies of the United States, and it's really an inner point of view. But one of the things that, Huma, you talk about is how you've always been a very shy and somewhat retiring person, and in some of the photographs you can always see you in the background. Is that one of the reasons that while your book is the telling of incidents and it's filled with what happens across these two presidencies, we still know very little about you? And is the reason perhaps that when your father passed, it's something that impacted you in the way that it did?
No one has actually asked me that in my 7 months on this book tour, but for those of you who've read the book or know anything about my life, my father did have a profound impact on me, and he was born in New Delhi and was a true Indian patriot through and through. I mean, I share the stories in the book that he was one of 6 boys, and he had 6 sisters. And he was the only boy to survive until adulthood. And it's only after he died, all these things about, for those of you who are South Asian who understand the power of the oral history, the oral tradition, passing along these stories, I've only in the last, since I've written the book, started thinking about the fact that, can you imagine having 5 siblings, who you lost? And so that was the man who kind of came into this world, was an avid sort of had an avid curiosity, but also a sense of right and wrong, that every day he woke up and said, all right, what is the right thing to do? What is the next right action that I could take? And I share how when he was 21, he was an equestrian and he rode for the school's equestrian club. He was thrown from his horse and he broke his back. And so every day when you started the question by saying you're very shy and I am all of those things. I also think I suffered for many years from what in America we now very commonly talk about as having imposter syndrome. I very often did not think I was good enough, smart enough, that I was worthy. And I don't think that's how my father raised me. I mean, when we were little, he broke his back, and then, back then the only recovery was you had to lie on a burlap sacks, and he did that for a year until he recovered, and then he went to the United States because in my family education was a religion, and he went to get his PhD, met my mother, fell in love. But the way he raised us was to be, I have memories when I was 8, 9 years old being in his office. He had a foundation and a journal, an academic journal that he started, and it was all about discipline and moderation. We could drink Coke and have ice cream, but we had to have our almonds and honey every single morning and our homeopathic pills every single morning. He was always into sort of alternative Ayurvedic medicine at a time when people were like, oh, your dad has all these wonky ideas, but that's just who he was. And one of the stories that didn't actually make it into the book, because it is a long book, is when I was 16, and we would take horseback riding lessons in New Jersey every summer. I was actually thrown from my horse, Buttercup. And I remember lying on the ground thinking I was literally dying. It was the most excruciating pain. I landed right on my tailbone. I lost control of her, and she went into a canter instead of a trot. And my mother runs over with my German riding instructor and my father. They all run over, and my mother looks at my dad and she's like, "That's it. Like, this is too dangerous. She can't do this. She shouldn't be doing this. Like, we're going home immediately." And my dad and my riding instructor look at each other, and my father looks at me and says, you're going to get up and you're going to get back on that horse. And he did. He made me. And I was in such excruciating pain. I remember I got on that horse and he says, if you don't do it, you will be fearful and she will be fearful. And obviously that's a cliche, but part of it is that was the sort of the strength of will that he had in this world. And I think it is good to be reminded of that way of approaching this world, because we are living, in my opinion, in very scary times. In America, the record number of people who talk about their challenges with mental health, and the very first line I wrote in the book when I started writing my book was my father, he was diagnosed with renal failure when I was 2, and we lived in Michigan, and he was told he had 5 to 10 years and to get his affairs in order. And I wrote, the first sentence I wrote in my book was, my father was told he was dying, and so he went out and he lived. And that was his approach to the world. And so if you get through my book, you'll recognize that you'll learn that I went through some very challenging periods in my life, and a brief moment where I didn't think I could go on, like it was too hard. Except what does keep me going is that notion of my father, of not wanting to disappoint him. He died when I was 17. And I do think that after being I was this very kind of in your face, love to read my poetry. I was very confident. It's the confidence I believe I got from him. But when I was 17 and he died, I think it took some of that away from me. And then I moved to the United States. And my father always said to me, he says, when you move to America, because I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and he said, when you move to America, it's going to be a revolution, this cultural shock to go from, living in a very restrictive society to then being able to do whatever you wanted. Everything about being in a democracy and being in America, you can make any choice. And he says, and you can do that. Just know that no freedom is absolute. And we were talking about democracy early on. No freedom is absolute. Every decision and choice you will make in your life will have consequences. So just think about what those things are before you do them. And so in part, really this book is just really a love letter to my dad.
And talking about freedom, she didn't even kiss once in university, so I'm not sure about how that worked. But going back for a second to the other person who's such a strong presence in the book is your mother. Yeah. And for many of us who know about the Middle East or Saudi Arabia as being so restrictive, here she was, your father had passed, her kids were there, she just continues to stay, and she creates this magic and sets up a new university. And for us, I think many of us, that possibility that a woman could do all of that was impossible.
I appreciate you asking me about my mother, because my father is written about as a hero in the book, but my mother was the real, she was the woman who she aided and abetted the illusion. I basically had a father who was terminally ill, and I thought my father was a superhero. I was looking through his medical records when I was researching the book, and in the months before he passed away, my father weighed 85 pounds, which is, I weigh 106. That's a staggering number. But she made it all seem like it was easy to do. She was living in a very culturally restrictive environment. She was a sociologist, a teacher. There's a belief in the Middle East that there is anyone who is your teacher, who educates you, who gives you knowledge, you are forever indebted to. The respect that you are to show your teacher, your giver of knowledge, is really unparalleled. And so my mother was seen in that way. Whenever we'd wander around and say, well, what are your parents doing? I'd say, well, my mother's professor. Like, oh, she's doctora, wow. Like, it was automatically this notion of a professor was seen at an elevated level. And I think that is what gave her this ability. She loved teaching, but she was just determined. And to go in the 1977 is when he moved to Saudi Arabia, to go in and look at sociology textbooks that were outdated by 20 years. She brought in new textbooks. She just did it, and in the 1990s, she started a university along with a group of other Saudi, businessmen, but also women. But she was the force that drove that university, and it's a university that thrives until today, and I think it's one of the greatest legacies. I'm so proud of her and what she's been able to do.
Share a little bit more about Saudi Arabia. Hillary Clinton and you went back to Saudi Arabia. It was a great moment because it was your mother's university that was chosen not by you, but was recommended by the professors, etc. But there you were, and I think the lady who was driving the car had just got arrested, maybe a few months before. So tell us what happened there. Did you all have a role in actually letting her out? But more importantly, when the visit finished, your mother took Hillary Clinton aside, much to your protestations, and sat her down and had a mother to an adult conversation about you, both people who loved you dearly.
Well, that trip was in February of 2010, and Hillary was Secretary of State, and amongst the many countries she was visiting on a trip to the Middle East, one was to Saudi Arabia, one of our key allies in the region, and so she was there to have a meeting with the king, who is, by the way, at his desert camp, and a desert camp for a Saudi king is basically like a palace. So we had quite an adventure, and amazing, and I write about this in the book, Wandering, what it is to eat with a king, and how, there'd be this long buffet. We walked into this tent, and there was this long buffet of food. And so Hillary and the king are given a
starter service.
A plate with spoons on it. And so they were meant to go to each dish and taste it, and if they liked it, to tell the gentleman behind them they wanted that food. Well, Hillary had no idea about this process, and none of us had warned her. So by the time she gets to the end of the buffet, there was so much food, and then goes to her table, they start bringing her out plates of all the things that she would taste and nod and say, that's very good. So she had 3 plates of food, and she calls me over. She said, but I'm full. I said, well, you're going to have to be a glutton for your country. And then she sits down and starts preparing her notes to talk to His Majesty about our bilateral issues, and he presses a button and a TV screen comes up from the center of the table so you could watch the afternoon soccer game. And one of the things that she was learning in real time is that in the Middle East, there is the time to eat and there's a time to work. But I had recommended, she'd wanted to go speak to young people, and particularly women. And our ambassador at the time recommended, and obviously I was biased, my mother's university, it's called Dar al-Hikmah, and it's a university, it's a girls' college. And in part, the impetus for this university was post 9/11. We should be no surprise to anybody. It was very hard for Saudi students. Some parents were worried about sending their children, and particularly their daughters, abroad, and particularly the United States for university. They were worried about the hardships they might face there. So they decided to do something that a lot of the Gulf countries have now done. If you just look at Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, we're just going to build a university here, a world-class, and my mother followed an American curriculum, and they did, and it was met with great success. And the reason I wanted Hillary to go is because one of the things, and this is when I put my Eastern hat on versus my Western hat on, is there's a sense that those of us who are raised in that part of the world, those of us who are Muslim women, that we are subjugated, that we don't have opinions, that we're forced to cover, that we live these very, oppressive lives. And to see these young women be just so brilliant and vibrant and provocative in their questions. I mean, here she was answering questions about Iran and, the West and, the Iraq War. I think she was blown away how brilliant they were. And it starts with conversations I had from childhood, which is you can't operate in any world assuming, no matter who you are, saying I am better than you. The only way we're going to have a dialogue, and particularly a bilateral dialogue, and I still believe America is the greatest democracy in the world, and I am a patriot, but you have to approach other democracies and other countries in the world as equal partners at the table in order to see eye to eye and maybe actually see things from their perspective. And this was a unique way for Hillary to be in that room and to talk to these girls. And for me, ultimately, it's all about choice. Plenty of these girls obviously don't have choice, but plenty of them do, and plenty of them are and lots of them, and just about all of them are proud of who they are and their heritage and where they come from. The driving, as you mentioned, Manal al-Sharif had just been recently detained because driving was illegal in that country. Now, there's no actual law that says that, but the guardianship laws in Saudi Arabia said that women, if they were to travel, they had to have what's called a mahram, which is an escort. So it's your father, your brother, your son, your husband. And these are just centuries-old cultural traditions that have been relics that are slowly coming apart. And I will say, every year I go home to Saudi Arabia, you see a new, now we have movie theaters. Now we have, things like, when I was growing up, if I went to Wendy's, which was like, by the way, this hot place to eat was Wendy's. Growing up in the 1980s in Saudi Arabia, I would go in to the women's section, and there was a partition, and I would eat with my girlfriends here, and then my brother and his friends would eat in the men's section. I mean, that was just the norm. These things have now changed, but it's, you know, come over time.
And your mother and Hillary.
Oh, thank you. So for those of you who might know, back then I was engaged to Anthony Weiner, who is a member of Congress from New York, who my family didn't really know. And they had a lot of they had a lot of misgivings. We had different faith backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. I met him in 2001 on Martha's Vineyard, and he was this charismatic, dynamic, I mean, really brilliant man. And I had never quite met anybody like him, and I've met a lot of men in my lifetime, and so we were first best friends.
But not kissed.
I did eventually kissed him, but we first became best friends, and then we fell in love, and we got engaged, and we called my mother knew a little bit about him, but she was living in Saudi Arabia and between Saudi Arabia and London, and so she was very, you know, she had a lot of hesitations, as did my brother. And so when she saw Hillary in that February 2010 trip, Anthony and I were meant to be married that summer, she still was very nervous. And so she pulled Hillary after this official event into a room. I didn't know this. It was a surprise to me. I tried to stop it. But Hillary's like, no, I want to talk to her. And she sat her down and said, look, my daughter has spent more, I'm jealous of you. My daughter has spent there's a chapter in the book called Calling White House Signal. It's in 1998. It was my first, but I had just been hired at the White House. And I'm at a family wedding. And for those of you who know what a DC wedding's like it's a thing. It's a thing, and it's many days, and you go to the wedding. And I got a call in the middle of the wedding from my supervisor saying the First Lady is leaving for Argentina. Do you want to go and advance that trip? And I talk about that call as being my fork in the road. That one, you know, path was right in front of me, you know, family, wedding, you know, and the other was taking that call and going on some adventure and doing whatever it is that I didn't even know what was expected of me. And I always took the call. That's what I write. My father always told me a good life is a balanced life, but I didn't do that. I was always work. And so here I am, fast forward, 20 years later, in love with this man. And my mother, you know, said to Hillary, I'm jealous of you because my daughter has spent more of my life with you than she has with me. And I am nervous about this wedding. I'm nervous. I don't know this young man. And can you give me some advice? And can you imagine the situation Hillary was in? And she gave what I thought was the best answer she possibly could. Her daughter, Chelsea, was getting married the same month I was. And she said, look, all I can tell you is I've never seen her so happy. And maybe the best thing that we can do is trust our children to make the right choice for themselves. And that was the advice she gave my mother, and they both, you know, got kind of emotional, and I interrupted the meeting. And but it was quite a moment. It was a really heavy moment between these two women who were very important to me.
Huma, going back, you know, you joined as an intern. 6 or 7 months later, you were offered your first job. And in those days, interns, you rarely ever saw the president or, in fact, Hillary Clinton. But very quickly, you know, you found your way to their private chambers. You were handing in papers. And then the way that you became an indispensable part of that regime. Tell us, what was it? What was the connect? Hillary, of course, was going through a very difficult time herself, given the charges against the indictment against the president on the Monica Lewinsky case. What was it like, and what happened? Just at the personal level, not at the book level.
Yeah, you know, when I started as an intern in the White House, it was September of 1996. And so I actually went to Little Rock for the re-election campaign. There was just all this optimism and hope and energy and possibility. It was a very exciting time to be a Democrat, and certainly to be in the White House. When the story broke, I say this now a lot to younger women. I mean, I was raised in a fairly sheltered environment, to the point that you made. I mean, I didn't have a lot of intimate relationships. I had no intimate relationships with men really until my husband, and that's just the way I was raised. I mean, so to hear the Monica Lewinsky story break, and watching it on the front page of the newspaper, and I had just started working for her. In fact, I share the story in the book. The first event I was sent to staff that morning the story broke in the Washington Post. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight now 20 years later because you use the word indictment. I mean, actually, that entire episode was a political charade, as it was then, later concluded in that the impeachment they should have never gone through with the impeachment, and Newt Gingrich, who was on the Republican side, who was leading the charge, was simultaneously having an affair with a young staff member while he was married. I mean, the hypocrisy in politics, and by the way, I say that for everybody, the hypocrisy in politics can sometimes be quite jarring. But we didn't know that at the time. Because I had been an intern, so when I watched it on the news, I said, there's no way. This can't be true. I don't even see him. It's not possible. And so that was my initial reaction. And I was such a junior member on the totem pole that for me, the way we all dealt with watching the First Lady of the United States all of a sudden just deal with the gaggle of press and all this stress and this nonstop barrage was just try to protect her. Do my job as best as I possibly could. And that's how I navigated my way through that time. But it was a very personally, especially when President Clinton admitted that the story was true, it was very a personally, obviously shocking and devastating time. I was confused. I didn't really understand it because from my perspective, I was like, wait, we're doing all this amazing stuff is happening. I go in every single day. In fact, I would write about walking into the office, taking healthcare letters, or working on an early childhood development conference in the like so much was happening on a daily basis. And then CNN would be on, and it would be the special investigator Ken Starr. I'd be like, "What's he talking?" It was such a removed process. And then, sure enough, I mean, obviously, we all watched how that impeachment scandal played out, and how Hillary kind of took her to stratosphere.
In fact, in the book, you talk about this one incident where you're in the car and Hillary reacts.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, also lots of funny stories in the book. Like, I lost her clothes in the East River because it was my first trip.
It just flew off. The whole baggage flew off.
I had no idea. It was the White House back then. It was like sink or swim. They kind of threw you into it and said, go do this, and you didn't really get a lot of direction. So my first trip to New York, when President Clinton was speaking to United Nations, I didn't know that when a president traveled, there was more than a helicopter beyond Marine One. I just figured there was Marine One. But I was like on staff helicopter number 4 with all the luggage, and that landed on the Wall Street landing zone. I was taking all the luggage off with the other staff, and then my helicopter takes off so that the Clintons' helicopter can land. And as it lands, the rotor or the prop wash lifts her hanging bag of clothes and flings it into the East River. And I remember running inside and a guy walking out with a broom saying, "This has never happened before." And I threw it into the back of the van and somehow figured out how to dry clean it. She walked on stage the next morning to give a speech, and she had no idea. We actually didn't tell her for years. But reasons I share the story, I mean, then there was the speech incident, which I think what you're talking about. The first Washington speech I was supposed to staff, I'm sitting in the motorcade. She's in this fancy limousine, many cars ahead, and I'm holding on to the speech really tight because I want everything to be perfect. It's my first time. And she goes on stage, and one of the few instructions I'd been given was never be in the shot, always be in the background. And she's on stage about to give her speech, and she does this. And I'm in the back thinking, okay, this cannot be good that I'm being called to stage. And I walk up to the stage, and she looks at me, and she says, "I don't have the right speech." And I remember in that moment this fire from the bottom of my feet to my head. And I said to her for the first time that day, "I got it," which, by the way, of course, I did not have it. I didn't even remotely have it. And I went running to the cars. And sure enough, in the limousine, I opened the door. And we're in the height of impeachment, by the way, in this moment. I opened the door, and sure enough, on her seat is a copy of the speech with plenty of notes, the whole car ride she was making edits. And I run it back inside and watch her shuffle the papers and fully expect to be fired at the end of this. And when she walks off stage, instead of reprimanding me or yelling at me, she said, "You should probably ride in the limousine with me from now on." And it was her way of acknowledging that for this symbiotic relationship to work, I needed to know everything that she knew. And from then on, I was always in the limousine. The story you're referring to, which I don't get a chance to talk about very often because a lot of people don't remember how intense, how insane it was every single day, was in the heat of impeachment when it was about to go into a Senate, passed in the House and it was about to go into the Senate. for President Clinton to be impeached, and he was he did not succeed in the Senate, but we didn't know at the time. And I remember a long day of events, and it was just back to back to back to back. And at the end of the day, we go to this very fancy fundraiser into somebody's house, and it was a buffet dinner, and everyone was meant to go and get their food. And the hostess comes to me asking me a very simple question: is the First Lady going to make her own plate of food? And I was so, there was so much tension in the air, and it was such a long day, and she was in the middle of conversation. I said, I don't know, I'm gonna ask her. So I went right up to her. She was in a conversation with somebody. I said, Mrs. Clinton, are you gonna, make your own plate of food? And she seemed annoyed at me, frustrated. And she said, yes. And she goes into this room, and everyone else is waiting now. They've all collected their food, and they're waiting in this living room for her to give a speech about the Democratic Party and the midterm elections. And she picks up the plate, and she stares at all the food, and it's just me and her in this dark dining room. And then without doing anything, she takes the empty plate and she slams it back down and says to nobody in particular, this is not working. And here I am, I have my dream job. I've traveled the world with this woman. I'm just getting the hang of it. And of course, I believe she's talking about me, that I'm not working, that I'm not doing well enough. And I remember getting in the car and I called my boss, Kelly, at the time, saying, well, I just got fired. It's horrible. We're all miserable. We're all, so tired, and this, I just can't please her. And we get to the White House. She goes inside the residence into the South Side, and I start walking away, and the White House usher comes running out saying, the First Lady's asking for you. And I was preparing, as lamb to the slaughter, and she was about to say, I'm sorry, you're just not good enough, smart enough, whatever enough. And I walk inside that diplomatic reception room, and I remember holding back tears. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to hold back tears. And I look up, and she just pulls me in and gives me this huge hug. And she said, I'm sorry for what I said earlier. I just want to tell you that we are all under such an enormous amount of pressure. And we're all doing the best we can, and we're all figuring out the best we can. And I'm sorry for the way I talked to you. And I just want to thank you I don't think I thank you enough for what you do for me every single day. And we walk in together, and she gets into the elevator and says, I'll see you tomorrow. And I go back to, the reason I share that story in the book is that here's this woman, the weight of the future of our democracy is on her shoulders. And the empathy that she showed for a 21-year-old who had really no idea what she was doing in that moment, I think says volumes about who she is as a human being.
And why couldn't she, or with the help of the comms team, actually communicate this during her election campaign? Why did everybody go away feeling that she was just a robot, only interested in her work, and there was no humanity, whereas in actuality, what your book shows is that she's not just empathetic, but she's deeply concerned as a human being.
She is. She was raised in a world where for women to be leaders, you had to be tough. You had to be smarter than the man at the table. She never, and number one, she was never one of those personalities where she believed it was about her. I know plenty of politicians who like to go into events and they get this huge rush of you get something out of the sort of the adulation and adoration.
Clinton himself, the president himself, to some extent.
There's a long list, and Bill Clinton is certainly admitted that the energy that he's gotten from the crowd, it's a give and take. She would walk off stage and say, okay, that woman I met, she's got a healthcare problem, let's follow up with her. That person I met, she is a policy wonk, a doer, it's the campaigning part that I think she always struggled at. But it is because women who came into the world, she was the first commencement speaker at Wellesley College. When she graduated, she was the first woman law partner at her law firm in Arkansas. She was the first. So she was leading the way in so many ways. When Hillary Clinton, or I should say Hillary Rodham at the time, was married to the governor of Arkansas, when he won his election the first time and he ran for re-election, he lost. One of the reasons he lost, which was very widely documented at the time, is because people were so shocked that his wife was Hillary Rodham. And that when their daughter Chelsea was born in 1980 and the news announcement was made saying Governor Clinton and Hillary Rodham welcome their daughter, Chelsea Clinton. It's like, what's wrong with her? Why does she have her own name? And by the way, this was also at a time when she could not have a credit card in her own name. That was society at the time. And when she ran in 2008, we had research that showed that people did not see women as leaders, as executives. It's much easier in my country to run for Congress or run for Senate, to run for a collaborative office than it is to run for a chief executive. So running for governor is harder. Running for mayor is harder. I live in New York City. We've still not had, a female mayor, even though we've had plenty of women, qualified women, who run. We don't see women in executive leadership positions. So the highest, forget commander-in-chief, she was always seeking. So she believed she had to be tough and strong. And by the way, she was. I mean, she was often the smartest, person at the table in a lot of these debates. But you're right, we are living at a time, and maybe we've always lived at a time, where this visceral reaction to a person, we talked about this in this last panel, Maya Angelou would say, people often don't remember what you say when you give a speech, but they will always remember how you made them feel. And that says a lot.
The energy of it. And is that one of the reasons why on election day you all decided that you will choose a venue with a glass ceiling?
Oh, yeah. Look, the history of what she was doing was not lost upon us. And it was this kind of symbolic moment. We talked about renting out the Javits Center, the Jacob Javits Center on the west side of Manhattan. It was a very expensive undertaking, but this notion of what this would mean for our daughters and granddaughters. And by the way, when we learned, the next day, and the world knows that Donald Trump won, more people voted for her. I mean, whenever people say, well, you guys didn't have any momentum, and why did you have no energy? Well, I'm sorry. We had enough energy that 3 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton than they did, for Donald Trump. And I think it's more the shock of why did so many people vote for him? Because our country is divided. And so, of course, in the end, people will vote Republican and vote Democrat. And so I do like to remind people that she did convince people. Her mandate did break through and was successful. It's just the way that our system works, that 70,000 votes between key states made a difference. And we were talking about in our earlier panel the impact of social media. You cannot discount the massive impact it had on that election, that when you are somebody who's accused of being crooked every single day, over and over and over again, even though you're investigating and they never find anything, and particularly with women, it's why the Comey letter that reopened the investigation into her emails, looking into my emails on Anthony's laptop, was so earth-shattering, because particularly women in the last 10 days of the campaign said, I don't know what she did wrong, but there's got to be something. And you didn't know what it was, and there were no facts to back it up. But to the point about making those feelings, so it was that. It was the fake news that was constantly out there. I tell this story a lot of in the middle of the campaign. A friend of ours, Patty from Arkansas, called and said, I went for my checkup the other day, and her medical doctor in Arkansas, she's in conversation with him, and the doctor says, we have a conversation about the election, and Patty says, I'm supporting Hillary, and he says, how could you support Hillary Clinton? She's had 12 people killed. And Patty's like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, there's an email, there's a list. I'll send it to you of all the people she's had killed. And sure enough, he forwards her some fake, some email, including many people, including her dear friend Vince Foster, who'd committed suicide. And these kinds of stories, I mean, there are people in America today who believe that my party is a group of pedophiles because of Pizzagate that came out of, again, another set of fake news stories. All of these lies and misinformation had an impact. And when we would say things in 2015 and 2016, people would say we were crazy, like, oh, there can't be fake ads on Facebook. That's just not possible. All these things, turned out to be true. When she said there was a vast right-wing conspiracy in 1998 conspiring against her husband, people thought she was crazy. Well, it turns out she was right. It's just like, all the things that she predicted. And the last thing I'll say, this notion about her health really also broke through. And we would laugh at these stories saying, ha ha, she's dying. People are saying she's dying. That's not. People believed it. People believed that she was terminally ill.
And Comey, what drove him to do what he did? I mean, was it this? You know, you haven't talked about in the book. You've only suggested. Was it deliberate? Was it a Republican thing? Was it Russians? I mean, why did he, at this very crucial time, open the investigation again?
He
This is on the leaked emails, the Yahoo emails and her own emails, and both.
So they, I have not. You really would have to ask him that question. Whether, because as I understand it, what he has said publicly is that it was not driven. It was not driven by politics. What I will say about the email story from day one, which was an issue right at the beginning of the campaign, right in April of 2015 when she announced that she was running, that what she did had been done by people before and since. I mean, there were officials in the Trump administration that also used personal email. The investigation was concluded, and she was cleared of wrongdoing. And the irony is, the server, this like famous Clinton server that everyone said was like in her basement, when I was at the State Department, I would get emails saying the State Department server has been, whatever, is been hacked, whatever, there's been issues, use your personal emails. In all the years, to my knowledge, that server remained secure. We complied, we all provided our emails. What reopened the investigation, just to remind people, is Anthony was being investigated for his relationship with an underage young woman. And in the course of investigating his laptop, they found some metadata, some emails that were mine on his laptop. And we don't know how those got on there. The part that none of us understand is I was a cooperating witness in that investigation. Nobody called my lawyer to say, hey, we found this, can you guys answer questions? That information was then given to the New York FBI. And we already know that there were people in that FBI that were, partisan and were not enthusiastic about my boss potentially being president. So I remember being in Florida. It was October, like 26th, 27th, whatever, 24th. And Hillary just celebrated, or was about to celebrate her birthday, and we said, let's go to an Adele concert. And I remember we had a long day, and then we took a little bit of a break, and I was at in my hotel, and there's breaking news, and Rudy Giuliani does an interview on CNN or somewhere, and says, oh, there's about to be big news. The New York FBI has big news. Well, how did he know? And why wasn't the process that a group of people who willingly responded to the request, willingly provided emails, thousands and thousands of pages. We all went in to be interviewed by the FBI. We didn't have anything to hide. I certainly had nothing to hide. All of a sudden, he knows something, which was totally inappropriate. And long story short, the New York FBI, again, instead of, they send it to Comey. And Comey, instead of calling Hillary's lawyer or my lawyer, sends a letter to Congress and says, oh, by the way, I close this investigation after clearing her. It's 10 days before the election. It makes me mad even when I sit here thinking about this. And I'm going to open it again. So they reopen the investigation. They look through all the emails. The Sunday before the election, 2 days before, in any normal democracy around the world, and by the way, you would say including our own, you would say you would not try to make some earth-shattering suggestion the days before the election, as we learned in France a few short weeks after our election, and that was devastating. The Sunday before, it says, oh, just kidding. There's nothing here. It's all duplicates of what we've already seen, so we're closing the investigation again. So what did that do? What it did is it got his supporters, because Trump had already been saying they're going to steal the election, saying they're about to steal the election. And anybody who doubted on the Democratic side said, I don't know, this is like weird. And so we lost people, and it really it's less that we lost people, but we did lose people, but also people were really motivated to vote for him.
I'm going to come back to the election in a second, and I know we've been given a roundup call, but you yourself had so much of anger. You'd married Anthony in the lovely ceremony, etc. your child, you were expecting, and that first news broke. And initially you didn't make much of it, and you let it ride. And then the second and the third incident happened, till the point that you realize somebody said for the first time to you, this is an addiction. And that's when you were able to persuade him to go. But, so two thoughts. One is, what made you stay on? And I know some of it is to do with Jordan, but I'd like you to talk about that. And two, mental health is one of the biggest ticking time bombs in the world. Many of us don't acknowledge it. And the fact that you didn't acknowledge or even recognize it for a whole period of time, maybe because you were flying around between places. How did that sort of turn in your own life? How did you bring it? How did you deal with it?
I talk about mental health, I think, every session, panel, interview I do, because and now it's, as you said, I mean, it is a ticking time bomb around the world, and certainly the studies that I've read in our country, it's a real, I think it's actually a little bit of a national epidemic. It's just this notion of anxiety and depression and mental health. We all just learn from the models before us. And so for me, I had the, pleasure and privilege of watching two parents who, they were loves of each other's lives. My mother was 50 when she was widowed, and it never even crossed her mind that she was going to embark on a relationship with another man. My father was the love of her life and remained so. That was my model. The level of respect, the level of adoration, and this sense of like, that's what I wanted. And I thought I had that with Anthony. It's why I write in the book the story of waking up at Buckingham Palace. And Anthony was 46 when we got married. I was 35. And I got pregnant very soon after we were married. I thought I was I lived a dream. I lived a fairy tale. I lived the perfect life. I mean, he was a well-known congressman. We couldn't walk down the street without somebody stopping to take a photo with him, taking a picture with him. We were invited to every party in New York. I mean, the future that had been laid out publicly for Anthony was certainly a very bright one. The first time the story broke, and again, going back to the notion of social media, his compulsiveness really began with the advent of Facebook and Twitter, which came about in that time, 2008, 2009. This notion of being in secret conversations with people who, the more adoring the conversations were, the more he sought that out. I didn't know any of that. I lived in the world of, we get up every single day and we help people. We're in public service. Our lives are amazing. So I was like, just knock it off. This is so stupid. We have such important work to do and such important things to do. It did not occur to me for a second that he couldn't just stop it, because I am somebody who exerted such self-control my whole life. I mean, damn, I wrote in my book, I was a virgin until I was 32 years old. And I had no issues with that. That is my level of self-control. I am that person who could fast every single day when everybody else was like around me was at a state banquet. Talk about the differences between us. So no, I did not have that empathy for Anthony. I did not understand. I just said, knock off this nonsense. And in fact, what happened was, after the first scandal and it broke and Anthony had to resign from Congress, I write a whole chapter in the book about feeling the shame, feeling like the elephant in the room, being disinvited from parties, asked to not be present. I still, in the back of my mind, have a feeling that when I go to a panel or a session, that no one's going to show up, because people are not going to want to be seen with me or be in a room with me. This is work that I continue to do on myself, and that was done to us. And so when you're in this bubble together, when it's you, the two of you, I really felt like after that first scandal, it was me and Anthony against the world in some ways. And that's one of the reasons I stayed. And I stayed in large part because of Jordan. My father was taken away from me, and I wanted to give my son a chance to have a house with two parents. And I also I deeply loved him. And I didn't, at 46, even now I have to acknowledge, I mean, he was the only real love that I had in my life. And now that I'm navigating this whole new world of like seeing men again, I mean, it's scary being back in the world. And it took me several years to understand that it was an addiction, that he needed sustained help, that he has to keep working on himself, and he's committed to do that. And I'm all about the cycle of the next generation. How do I raise my son to not, just respect women, but fear their power. And one of the stories I love to tell is, you know, I tell Jordan every feeling is okay. And I tell him how much he's loved and how much it's okay to not be okay. And a couple of years ago, we were very lucky to be staying at a friend's house, and Roger Federer was coming over to play tennis with the kids. And I remember saying to Jordan as we're walking over to the tennis court, I said, Jordan, you are about to play tennis with the greatest tennis player of all time. And he turns to me and he says, Mommy, Serena is coming? And the notion that that is his automatic, that's who he thinks is the greatest tennis player of all time, to me says, all right, you know, we've done okay. And that is life, you know, long work that we have to do. We owe it to our kids.
You know, I would have loved to continue this, but we can do it over lunch, really talking about democracy in America and how do you fix it because of the inequity, because of the disenfranchisement of people who are not necessarily white because of the police. But we can do that later. But last question for you. The book is out. It's a fabulous book. You've put your story out there. You've put yourself out there. When do we see you standing for public office?
Oh, I don't think I'm going to run for public office, at least not anytime soon. You know, I write this message to a lot of young women when I sign the book to them, which is consider doing the thing that scares you the most, because it's probably worth it, and I did. I was writing this book. And change. You know, I feel like November 2nd, 2021, I jumped off a cliff, and I'm now just navigating. And it's amazing and it's great. And every time I get a message from somebody, I find it very rewarding and gratifying, but it's also really scary. I mean, I do have to figure out what it is I'm gonna do. And I'm continuing to work on myself. I have days where I feel great. I have days where I feel a lot of anxiety about the state of the world. But I am defiantly optimistic, and in part coming and being in community. This, by the way, to me, actually is maybe the most important thing I can do for myself, which is to be with people smarter than me, interesting, just sharing, because I think we've all missed this in the last few years, and it's reminded me how important it is. That's why I brought Jordan to Jaipur. It's to be in each other's spaces and places, because that is how we become less divided. And I'd love to talk more about lunch, about how the divisions have become increasingly on opposite sides, and the only way forward is being forced to be in uncomfortable conversations. I look forward to it.
Ladies and gentlemen, the incredible Huma Abedin. And like I said, if you want an insight into, remember when she joined the administration, she was not only a person of color, she was also Muslim. She was in a strange place. She had come from Saudi Arabia. Despite, in many ways, the odds, she became what she was, and the White House then began celebrating Eid, apart from other things, and serving dates as part of breaking fast. So much of what you'll read in the book is really crushing the glass ceiling, which she's done, you know, in the most incredible way with Hillary Clinton, and now, of course, with people like AOC, etc. So thank you so much, Huma, for coming here all the way. It's really been a pleasure and an honor for us to have you. Thank you.